How do we build resiliency? As you know, resilient is one of our GST factor attributes. And our guest today is going to talk about how to build that resiliency based on the data, based on the medical research, based on so many resources out there in the world. She's going to talk about the importance of shifting our messaging that we use on ourselves, shifting that self-criticism into self-coaching. And if we change that just a little bit every day, 1 minute, 2 minutes, the amazing impact it can make on our lives. We're going to dive into the importance of knowing our why, knowing our purpose, having that alignment for our values, and then also exercising those beautiful boundaries. Our guest today is a global leader in psychological health and safety. Get your pen and paper because the nuggets that Dr. Allessandria Polizzi are going to drop today are going to be so impactful for you as leaders, you as workers, and all of us. Let's jump into the conversation with Dr. Al. Welcome to the GST Factor podcast. I'm your host, Misha Blameyer-Farish, and today I'm excited to have Dr. Allessandria Polizzi. Hi, Dr. Allessandria. How are you?
I'm good, Misha. And if it's easier for you, you can call me Dr. Al. That's fine.
Dr. Al, thank you so much. You're so gracious. Dr. Al, share with our amazing listeners today a little bit about your background and your story.
Yeah, well, so I'm a recovered academic / recovering chief people officer. So I've had several bouts of careers so far. And my last official job was working as a chief people officer for the fourth largest veterinary hospital company in the US, which is where I was exposed to the needs that I now focus on, which is helping people stay psychologically healthy and safe at work. And so that's what our company does. I've been doing this now for over 3 years. So we help organizations basically implement the global guidelines for creating psychologically healthy and safe workplaces.
An amazing career. I love the pivot that your life took into this arena. And I really want us to dive into this because I think that there's a couple camps, right? There's one camp that really understands it, is really engaged with it, is intentional with it. And I think there's still another camp that is not quite sure what the importance of it. So let's talk about those two camps and how can we educate and bring about more awareness in this today.
Yeah, I would say definitely in the US, the camp that's not really sure is by and large a well-forged town, probably more than a camp. But yeah, but globally, if we pull back and look globally, there has been a movement over the last 20 years to hold companies accountable for not just the physical health and safety of their employees, but also the psychological health and safety of their employees. And that's based on decades and decades of research that show that the workplace has a significant impact on our mental health and can create psychological injury in the same way a workplace can cause physical injury. And so different parts of the world have enacted legislation that require companies to put protections in place to audit against those known hazards. And there's 12 known hazards. And then in the EU, they will start requiring in 2025 that companies who work, including multinational companies, but companies that work in the EU over the next 5 years will need to start reporting on the hazards and how they are protecting their employees from these hazards. So this is something that is happening globally. In the US, we are very behind. So the camp will be, I don't know how we keep that metaphor going, but extracted into needing to actually better understand what it means to have a healthy workplace.
So let's talk about where our US companies are today and where they need to be. What's our roadmap look like? Where do they need to be? Obviously, the EU has this 2025 date. Where is our US today and where do we need to be going?
So in 2022, the US Surgeon General published a guideline focused on workplace mental health, and it created a roadmap for how you can approach it. I personally, like the week or day before that came out, the World Health Organization also came out with their guidelines, which I prefer to the US one, but either one's fine because they all ladder back to the same hazards. So where we are now is we really have a perspective that it is at an individual level that mental health is managed and is impacted, and that all the ways in which we show up at work, be it with having anxiety or depression or burnout, is driven at the individual level, and somehow companies are not responsible for the stress or other injury that can happen to people on the job, but that's just the job. And so that's a mindset we have here in the US. The second mindset we have in the US, which I find very fascinating, is a belief that somehow the cost is too much to help keep people healthy. That you need to prove an ROI of investing and having healthy workers, which I like. How expensive do you think it is to not have a toxic workplace? Like, what's the cost? Now, there are things about getting rid of brilliant jerks and toxic behaviors that, yeah, maybe, but we all know the data shows that better business outcomes happen when you have healthier workplaces. So the map to get to where we need to be is to really, it's a mindset shift to stop thinking about the psychological health of our employees as somehow different than the physical health of our employees, and somehow to be treated as something to be ashamed of, to ignore, pretend like doesn't exist. Or another binary we have is, if I can't erase the stressor, then we just have to suck it up. And there's a huge difference, a huge wide variety of choices you can take between suffering and removal. And so I work with a lot of companies that don't have the luxury of removing the stressors. So what do we do now?
I think it's so interesting and just fascinating to hear this perspective of it, right? And I think that, again, that mindset change for both leaders, but then also employees, I think is really important. So I'd love for our listeners to hear a little bit in your role as the ISO Global Liaison for psychological health and safety. Talk to us a little bit about that, what you're seeing in that space, what you do in that space, because I think that that is such an incredible position that you hold. And, I really want our listeners to kind of understand what that truly means and, the relevancy of that.
Yeah. So in 2020, ISO published what's called the ISO 45003. And anybody who's not familiar with ISO, they do global standards on everything from what's the right level of metal in a product and how do you manage oil and gas processing. Like, it's all very standard. And so they have all these different committees. So one of the committees they have is Occupational Health and Safety. And Occupational Health and Safety in 2020 published the ISO 45003, which is, as part of health and safety, addressing the psychosocial hazards, or the hazards we just talked about, to the mental health of your employees. There's also an HR committee. And so the HR committee, which is what I'm on, looks at standards and processes from a global perspective that companies can implement to make sure that they have quality processes and systems and tools. And so we've done everything from like recruiting to data analytics, yada, yada. So obviously, this concept of psychological health and safety really crosses over between occupational health and safety and human resources. Because historically, we thought of mental health, again, as the thing that we support through benefits, your EAP, we look at more clinical solutions. And occupational health and safety is about preventing injury. And so my role is to make sure that we look across both of those, again, globally. So we have our finger on the pulse of what is happening and how do we make sure that we have a standard that companies can use. That's not just opinion and everyone, weighing in. It's based on data and research, and it's consistent across the globe.
Let's talk to the leaders for a moment, because you and I are both entrepreneurs. We're in the entrepreneurial space. And let's talk to those founders and those leaders. What would you say to them? What is your best advice for them as they are building their organizations? And how do they take this into consideration at the ground level?
Yeah. So leaders are actually, I consider us a leadership development company. That is where I start, is with leaders and founders and executives, because the people who are suffering the most are actually in those seats. It's not your frontline employees. The data shows that by far, the higher up you go, the worse your mental health is. And it's simple math. If you're not healthy, how well do you think you're performing? And we have this kind of, again, belief that I have to be unhealthy in order to be a really successful entrepreneur or leader, or it's just part of the job. We're going to white knuckle our way through it. So what I recommend is the first thing we do is start with you. We start with leaders. We start with executives to make sure that they're healthy, because if they are not healthy, then they can't really take care of their teams. So how do we enable them to do their best work? And what are the known, and this is the one piece where my company is pretty unique, is that we start with the leader and the leader's needs, including being aware of the well-documented stressors that impact leaders specifically. And then the research that's been done on what can we do as leaders to prevent that creating harm so that you can be healthy and be able to support your team.
I think that's so important, is that I think so many times as founders, as leaders, we think, oh, we need to take care of everybody else. It's almost like parenting, especially us mothers. Oh, well, I need to take care of everybody else before I take care of myself. And it's actually the reverse. We got to take care of ourselves so that we can do all the things that we need to do. And so I hope that our founders and our leaders are listening, in that something like this needs to serve you first, so that ripple effect, that waterfall effect can happen within your organization. So now let's reverse the roles. If I am an individual sitting in an organization and I'm seeing and struggling within the workplace and seeing lots of toxicity, what is a way for me to evaluate myself and are there changes? Are there things that I can do to maybe be a catalyst in my organization?
Yeah, before we go to the individual, if I can go back to the leaders and the executives, it's fine for me to say leader self-care. I don't want to put a period on the end of that, because having been a leader and having experienced burnout myself, I don't know what to do to help fix it. And so let me talk about that before we move on, because I think knowledge is one thing, but how is really what the difference. So some specific things for leaders, and this is going to tie to the individual. If you can start with understanding your values and your goals, what is most important to you? So an activity that I have people do in our programs is we have people come up with your bumper sticker. What is the thing that you would want to be known for? People are looking at the trail you've left behind. What is your legacy? What do you want to be known for? I like to get it down to just one word if we can, because when I'm grounded in my values of who do I want to be as a leader, what do I stand for, then everything else we do ladders back to that. So when I'm having a high stress moment, I can make decisions based on what best connects to what's important for me. And the research shows that when I connect to my values, I'm getting connected to that like deep part of who I am. And it can help bolster us against some of the threats of burnout. So just starting with being clear about your purpose and your why is transformational and can be transformational for leaders as long as you stick to it. The other thing is to be really clear about what your boundaries are and get real comfortable with setting them. so that you can make sure that you're healthy. Okay, so that's the leader. 2 things you can take away. I can talk more about that, but 2 things you can take away. All right, as an individual, we have this thing in my book about, it's called the Workplace Mental Health Maturity Model. And it's basically sit down and say, just completely honestly, how open do you think this organization is? And how supportive do you think this organization is around these topics? Because if you're in an organization that actually rewards anti-healthy behavior, people burning the midnight oil, people who have sharp elbows, like fill in the blank, it's unrealistic for you to think that you're going to be able to convince everyone to completely change. Like, that's probably not going to happen. So I would say just be honest, blatantly, glaringly, just completely honest about what's the reality here. If there is room, then it's great to share some of these resources, share this podcast, share some of these things, bring in someone who can help guide and build a strategy. But the first thing I would actually start with before you start having those conversations is the same thing I recommended for leaders. What's your why, right? What is your purpose in trying to do that, or in trying to do anything at work? And so if you're clear about, again, your purpose for what you're trying to achieve for you as an individual, be a leader or an individual contributor, getting grounded in that has just been shown to have such great effect on your ability to then work with and support others.
And this is such a beautiful tie-in to what we talk about a lot here within the GSD Factor life, right? Of living a life of our 6 attributes of being confident, inquisitive, imaginative, being present, resilient, and influential. And we talk about when you activate those, it ignites that transformation. And what I love about what you're talking about, especially to the leaders, is knowing your purpose, knowing your why, staying true to your values, being your true authentic self is huge. What I also love is the boundaries component. And I think that that's so important for this day and age. And I think especially in this age of burnout, we've both burned out. We see a lot of colleagues burning out. And I like to call them beautiful boundaries because that's what they are. If you're putting those boundaries in place, they're a beautiful thing. So when you think about the impactful work that you're doing around the world and our GSD Factor attributes, which 1 or 2 do you feel like really resonate in your space as you are talking to leaders and individuals and organizations?
Well, resiliency obviously hit me, right? So there's so much out there about resiliency, and sometimes it may feel like a criticism versus an opportunity to learn. So let me be clear. Every person has resiliency skills, but not everybody learns about how to build more or what's been scientifically proven to be the most effective. And so that's where we focus. So when I burned out, I went to the research. I logged in my daughter's college library and I started reading study after study after study about what causes it, what prevents it, and how do we heal. And so, first of all, I want to know, is it a real thing or is it just something the kids say these days, which it is. So what I found are, and I call this our YMCA, which is understanding yourself, practicing mindfulness, practicing compassion, self-compassion in particular, and acceptance. And those are the 4, yourself is about getting grounded in your values as well. Those are the 4 most highly correlated tactics that you can do that will help you build resiliency. So if I'm more mindful and present, if I practice self-compassion, which is speaking to myself with kindness and not beating myself up all the time, and then radical acceptance, which is understanding what you can and can't control, having the courage to take the action and the knowledge to let go of most things which you don't control anyway. So that resiliency piece, I think, is crucial. And so a lot of what we've done has been around under the umbrella of building a resilient team, a resilient organization, and building resilient leaders, which is actually my next book, is a resilient leader workbook.
Amazing. Oh, you'll have to let us know about that. We'll be excited to help support. All right. We are asking all of our guests this year, what are you powerfully choosing in 2024, Dr. Al?
Practicing what I teach. So as an entrepreneur, it's so easy to fall into the burning the midnight oil, doing the things that you're not supposed to be doing. Personally, as somebody who's been diagnosed with depression, I have to really pay attention to my mental health and to making sure that I'm taking care of myself and that I'm thoughtful about my inner dialogue, right? So practicing self-compassion, practicing sticking to my why, practicing acceptance, and practicing mindfulness are key for me in 2024 and quite frankly for going forward in life.
I love that. You've dropped so many nuggets on us today, and which I thank you for. Your nuggets of wisdom, and I definitely encourage everyone to go out and get your book and your new book, workbook that's coming out as well. But if there was one thing you wanted to leave with our listeners today, what would that lesson be?
I believe, and this is what started me on this journey, when I first started my whole process of trying to recover from burnout, I read the phrase self-coaching instead of self-criticism. And a light bulb came on for me, and I've been in leadership development for 20 years for big companies, big brands. And I truly believe that if we could practice self-compassion or self-coaching instead of self-criticism, we can change the world. Because we have so much negative internal dialogue that just eats away at the human inside of us and thereby diminishes our ability to be healthy at work and to build healthy relationships and healthy behaviors. And when 70% of managers are rated as poor, according to Gallup, and that is consistent for decades, what we're doing to develop leaders doesn't work. And I believe, based on the research and my experience, that it is because they are not healthy themselves. And so if everyone who hears this could just spend a minute being kind to themselves, they will change the direction of how they lead and of the impact they have on the world.
It's so critical. It's so important. And I think for those that are parents or mentors or coaches or teachers, I think it's truly important to start that at a younger age too, is what would happen in our world today if we started that self-coaching and just transformed even just a couple minutes a day from self-criticism to self-coaching. What transformation would take place, not just for individuals, but in our schools and in our workplaces and in our cultures and in our countries. And I love that nugget that you've left us with because I think it is truly important. And I think we can make intentional shifts that will make such impactful changes throughout our lives.
Absolutely. And it's like flossing, you need to do it, but maybe some of us don't do it as often as we should, or exercising or whatever. This is for your health. It is for you, but it is not just for you. Research shows that they had all these studies on pediatricians who practice self-compassion around the world, multiple studies. What they saw were better patient outcomes when their pediatricians practice self-compassion. In other words, if I'm healthy, I have the ability and I activate the parts of my brain that make me better able to take care of others. And so it is not an investment in being selfish. It is actually an investment in your team.
Dr. Al, thank you so much for being with us. I feel like we could go on for hours and hours. But thank you so much for the message today, what you bring to the world. And we definitely want to continue to follow along as you continue to provide these amazing tools and resources. And to our listeners today, we hope that this has been super helpful for you. We thank you for listening. And don't forget to get shit done.
Thanks for listening to the GSD Factor podcast. If you liked this episode, please rate and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform, where you can also find previous episodes. Let's also connect on LinkedIn and Instagram. If you're looking for more information on the GSD Factor, visit us at gsdfactor.com. And always remember to GSD, get shit done.